The day she arrived at the facility, the heavy gates felt like they carried the weight of the world. She stepped out of the transport van with steady, careful movements. The guards barely glanced at her. They had seen plenty of people come and go, but she felt the eyes of the prisoners immediately. The men in the yard stared first out of curiosity, then out of disbelief. A woman in this place? Their laughter was soft at first, like a ripple across the concrete, but it grew louder the more she moved past them. She kept her gaze forward, walking with confidence, not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. Some of them whispered, some pointed, and a few even nudged each other as if to say, "This is going to be funny." She noticed everything. The way they tried to intimidate with their stares, the way they positioned themselves to appear bigger or stronger. But she didn't flinch. There was a calmness about her that made her hard to read. They expected fear, maybe nervous chatter or even tears. None came. Instead, she carried herself like someone who belonged somewhere else entirely, like she was only visiting this world for a short time. That small difference, the way she held her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the space without hesitation, made some of the men hesitate. They laughed anyway, trying to mask the flicker of doubt in their expressions. The yard was crowded, and the air smelled of sweat and concrete. The sound of chains, shouts, and footsteps filled the space, but she moved through it with a rhythm of her own, unhurried, deliberate. The men who had gathered near the fence began shouting comments, trying to get a reaction. They made crude jokes about her size, her hair, the way she walked. Some suggested she wouldn't last a day. Others laughed at her voice, calling it too soft, too polite for a place like this. She didn't answer them. She let the laughter roll over her like water over stone. Every step she took was measured, every glance precise. A few of the bolder men tried to step closer to block her path, but she sidestepped them smoothly, careful not to provoke unnecessary conflict. Even in a place designed to intimidate, she moved with control, making it clear she was aware of every detail around her. Inside, the hallways were narrow, echoing with the sound of metal doors slamming and voices calling out. The other women glanced at her with curiosity and some with relief. A few nodded in silent recognition, understanding that she carried herself differently. The men outside didn't see the small interactions, but inside, she had already begun to earn respect quietly. It wasn't about power yet, it was about presence. By the time she reached her cell, the men outside had grown restless. They thought they had her figured out. She was a woman alone, in a place full of men who had spent years learning how to survive on intimidation. They thought she would be easy to mock, but they didn't know that she had spent years preparing for situations just like this. They didn't know that she could read a room, analyze people, and act faster than anyone expected. The first night was quiet. She unpacked her few belongings with care, folding her clothes neatly and placing them in the small locker. She listened to the distant sounds of the prison, the guards making rounds, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional shout echoing down the hallways. Every sound told a story, and she paid attention. Even in a place designed to make people feel powerless, she remained aware, alert, and in control of her own mind. The next morning, the yard was alive with movement again. The male prisoners were curious, but they also wanted to test her. A few of them started with words, calling out crude comments, trying to provoke a reaction. She ignored them, walking past with her head held high. Some tried to get her attention directly, waving their hands, shouting her name, or asking if she knew how to fight. She kept walking. Each step was deliberate, showing that she was unbothered by their attempts at humiliation. One of the men, bigger than the rest, decided to make a show. He stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. The yard went quiet, waiting for her to react. The laughter that had been building moments before stopped abruptly. Some of the men leaned forward, eager for a confrontation. She looked at him calmly, assessing his posture, the way he held his weight, the tension in his shoulders. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. "Move aside," she said, her voice firm but steady. Not loud, just commanding enough that it carried authority. He laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, and stepped closer, trying to intimidate with his size. The other men laughed too, waiting for her to show weakness, but she didn't. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. She simply adjusted her stance slightly, balanced, ready if he tried anything. Her presence alone made the air tense. The bigger man expected a reaction, some fear, a nervous twitch, but he didn't get it. The laughter stopped. He backed up slightly, unsure why she wasn't reacting as expected. The other men exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and disbelief passing between them. From that moment, she realized she had the upper hand in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't brute strength or loud words. It was the calm in her demeanor, the way she refused to be intimidated, the way she controlled her own reactions. That silent confidence spoke louder than any insult or threat. Throughout the day, the men continued to test her in small ways. A comment here, a shove there. She responded only when necessary, and even then, she responded with control. Each time, the men realized that their usual tactics weren't working. She wasn't the typical person they had encountered. She was different, and they didn't know how to handle that difference. By evening, she had already established a subtle presence in the yard. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't exactly respect yet either. It was the beginning of recognition. They knew she wasn't someone to be taken lightly. And she knew that establishing this presence quietly, without overt aggression, was far more effective than proving it through conflict. Even as the sun set and the yard emptied, she remained alert, taking note of the routines of guards and inmates alike. She wasn't here to make friends, and she wasn't here to fight unless necessary. She was here to survive, to navigate a world that underestimated her at every turn, and she would do it with a quiet strength that no one expected. The first part of her story in the facility wasn't about battles or fights. It was about observation, understanding, and maintaining control of herself in a world designed to strip control from everyone else. She had walked in as a target, but by the end of the day, she had begun to transform into someone who commanded attention simply by refusing to be dismissed. She lay on the narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the prison. Her mind ran through everything she had seen, everyone she had met, and all the subtle dynamics that would matter later. She didn't just survive the day, she studied it. Each look, each gesture, each word mattered. Every laugh, every whisper, every taunt was a piece of information. Sleep came eventually, but not before she made a mental note of the patterns, the movements of guards, the interactions between inmates, and the subtle shifts in the yard when she walked through. She knew that the days ahead would be more challenging, but she felt ready. She had a plan in her mind, a strategy for navigating every interaction. And she knew one thing for certain. No one would make her feel small, and no one would underestimate her again. The next morning, the sun barely touched the yard when she was already up, moving with the same careful awareness she had shown on the first day. The air was cooler now, carrying the sharp scent of concrete and metal. Some of the men who had mocked her yesterday were already outside, lingering and whispering, trying to figure her out. They were curious and cautious, but they still wanted to push her, to see if her calm demeanor would crack under pressure. She walked through the yard slowly, deliberately, making sure her steps were heard but not exaggerated. She didn't avoid anyone, and she didn't rush. Her eyes scanned the space, noting small details. A man shifting his weight nervously, another fidgeting with his hands, someone else watching too closely. Every movement told a story, and she read them all without a single word. The first attempts at provocation came almost immediately. A couple of men called out, trying to grab her attention with jokes about her size, her voice, and the fact that she was alone in a male-dominated space. One of them even tried a shove as she passed by, expecting her to stumble or overreact. She didn't. She simply adjusted her balance and stepped past him, her face calm, her eyes steady. The man looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected someone to react so effortlessly. The others exchanged glances, a mixture of confusion and growing respect in their expressions. Some of the bolder inmates started testing her with words rather than physical gestures. "You think you belong here?" one asked, smirking. "You think you can survive?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowed her pace slightly, letting her presence speak for itself. Her silence made the question hang in the air, heavier than any argument she could have offered. The man shifted uncomfortably, realizing that she wasn't going to respond the way he expected. A few others tried to intimidate her with exaggerated displays, stretching their arms, puffing their chests, walking toward her as if to corner her. She simply observed, noting their patterns, their weaknesses, and their attempts to show dominance. She didn't react with aggression, but she didn't appear weak either. Each step she took, each glance she gave, communicated that she was aware and capable, and that she wasn't someone to be trifled with. The day continued with these small encounters. She learned quickly how to read the subtle signs of challenge and danger. A hand that lingered too long on a railing, a glance that darted in her direction, a shift in body weight. All of these were messages, and she interpreted them with precision. She found that by understanding the intentions behind actions, she could avoid unnecessary confrontations while still asserting her presence. During a brief break in the yard, she leaned against the wall, observing a group of men who had formed a circle nearby. They were laughing at something one of them said, but she noticed the tension beneath the laughter. They were trying to maintain control, to appear confident in a space where control was everything. She didn't approach them, but she didn't turn away either. Her posture, her calm demeanor, and the way she held her gaze subtly communicated that she was watching, noticing and understanding everything. One man, perhaps the most aggressive of the group, decided to test her more directly. He walked toward her, a smirk on his face, trying to provoke a reaction with words alone. "You really think you can handle this place?" he asked, leaning slightly forward. His eyes searched hers for fear, for hesitation, for weakness. She didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily, letting silence fill the space between them. The other men watched, waiting for a response, and in that moment the yard felt smaller, tighter, as if everyone was holding their breath. Finally she spoke, her voice calm and even. "I handle what I need to handle," she said. Nothing more. No threats, no anger, just a simple statement that carried confidence and authority. The man hesitated, clearly expecting something different. Her tone wasn't loud, but it held a weight that made him step back slightly. The others around him shifted uneasily, realizing that she wasn't the easy target they had assumed she would be. After that, the atmosphere began to change, slowly but noticeably. The men who had laughed at her before were quieter, more cautious. They were still curious, still trying to gauge her abilities, but they were less reckless. They realized that the woman they had dismissed was not someone who would react predictably, and that unpredictability made her dangerous in a different way. She spent the rest of the morning observing and learning. She noticed the routines of the guards, the way the prisoners interacted with each other, and the subtle hierarchies that determined who held influence. She wasn't interested in being part of any social games. She was interested in understanding the environment so she could navigate it safely. Her focus was on survival, on preparation, and on maintaining control of herself in a world where control was scarce. Lunchtime brought another challenge. The cafeteria was crowded, loud, and chaotic. She moved through the line with care, keeping her tray balanced, her movements deliberate. A few men tried to brush against her intentionally to provoke a reaction, but she didn't respond. Instead, she adjusted her tray and stepped around them with ease, drawing small glances from others who were watching. Some nodded subtly, recognizing her composure, while others looked frustrated that their attempts to intimidate her had failed. During the meal, she overheard conversations that gave her insight into the dynamics of the yard. Names, alliances, grudges, and rivalries were mentioned casually, revealing who held power and who was trying to climb the social ladder. She didn't participate, but she absorbed everything, storing it for later. Every detail mattered, and by the time she finished eating, she had a mental map of the social landscape that would guide her interactions in the days to come. In the afternoon, she returned to the yard, where the sun was now high and hot against the concrete. Some of the men who had been most aggressive in the morning tried again, testing her patience with small insults and gestures. She continued to respond with calm, measured actions. A simple glance, a slight shift in stance, or a deliberate step aside was enough to communicate that she was aware and prepared without escalating the situation unnecessarily. A group of men eventually tried to corner her near the wall, thinking that together they could intimidate her more effectively. She didn't panic. She stood her ground, letting them approach, carefully observing their movements and body language. She didn't raise her voice or make sudden gestures. Instead, she let the tension build naturally, letting them feel the uncertainty in her calmness. One by one, their bravado began to falter. They realized that she wasn't reacting the way they expected, and that made them uneasy. By the end of the afternoon, she had already established a subtle reputation. The men who had laughed at her on the first day were quieter, more cautious in her presence. They still tested her, but less recklessly, and with more thought behind their actions. She wasn't feared yet, but she was respected in a quiet, understated way. Her strength wasn't in force or aggression, it was in control, awareness, and composure. As evening approached, the yard emptied gradually, and the sounds of the day began to fade. She walked back to her cell slowly, taking note of who had watched her closely, who had challenged her, and who had remained distant. Every interaction had provided information, every movement had revealed intent, and she had learned from each one. She wasn't just surviving, she was understanding, preparing, and adapting. Back in her cell, she sat on the narrow bed, reflecting on the day. She thought about the subtle power of observation, the importance of patience, and the way control could be exerted without confrontation. She realized that her ability to remain calm under pressure was already reshaping the way people treated her. They weren't afraid yet, but they were beginning to recognize that she wasn't an easy target. Sleep came later that night, but not without careful thought. She reviewed the day in her mind, replaying interactions, analyzing gestures, and noting patterns. She understood that the days ahead would be even more challenging, and she prepared herself mentally for every possible scenario. Her strength lay not just in skill, but in understanding, preparation, and the quiet confidence she carried with her. By the end of Part 2, she had moved beyond being just a newcomer. She was no longer just a target of ridicule. She had begun to establish herself as someone who observed, understood, and controlled her environment. The men who had mocked her were learning, slowly, that she was different, and she was ready for whatever challenges the next day would bring. The next day, the air in the yard felt different. There was a quiet tension that hadn't been there before. The men who had laughed and shouted in her direction now watched with more caution. Some of them whispered among themselves, trying to figure out what had changed. She walked in calmly, her steps measured, her posture straight. She carried the same quiet confidence, but today, she was ready for more than just observation. A group of men had gathered near the center of the yard, clearly discussing her. She noticed the way they shifted their weight when she approached, the subtle glances that darted toward her. One of them, the largest and most aggressive, stepped forward as if he wanted to confront her directly. The others circled around him, giving the impression of support, but she didn't appear intimidated. She stopped at a respectful distance, her eyes scanning the group, reading their intentions with careful precision. "You think you can just walk through here like you own the place?" the large man said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. His chest was puffed out and his hands twitched slightly, a sign that he was testing himself as much as testing her. The other men laughed nervously, waiting for her reaction, expecting her to respond with fear or anger. She didn't move closer, but she didn't step back either. Her calm gaze met his directly. "I don't think about owning a place," she said evenly. "I handle what I need to handle." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. There was no anger, no challenge, just quiet authority. The man blinked, surprised at her response. He had expected her to shrink, to stumble over words, or to react aggressively. She had done neither. The other men shifted uncomfortably. They had underestimated her for days, and now they were realizing that their assumptions were wrong. Some of them tried to laugh to ease the tension, but it was clear that even they were uncertain. The large man stepped closer, his face tightening with frustration. "You're just a woman," he said, trying to provoke her. "You don't belong here." She didn't flinch. She adjusted her stance slightly, keeping her balance and maintaining eye contact. There was no threat in her movements, but there was control. Every muscle in her body was aware, ready to respond if needed. The other men noticed this, a silent message passing between them. She wasn't afraid, and she was prepared. One of the smaller men in the circle made a mistake. He laughed loudly, trying to encourage the larger man, and stepped a little too close. Instinctively, she shifted just enough to make her presence felt. It wasn't a push, it wasn't a strike. It was a subtle move, a demonstration of awareness and control. The man stumbled slightly and froze, realizing that even the smallest misstep around her could have consequences. The circle went quiet. The large man's frustration grew. He tried to assert dominance by stepping even closer, raising his voice. "Are you going to fight me?" he demanded. The other men watched, eager for a scene. They expected her to respond in kind, to match aggression with aggression. But she didn't. She remained calm, her breathing steady, her stance firm. "I don't need to fight anyone right now," she said. "But if it's necessary, I can handle it." Her words were precise, deliberate. The tension in the yard grew, the silence heavy. The men realized that she wasn't bluffing, that there was real skill behind her calm demeanor. Their assumptions were crumbling, replaced by uncertainty and cautious respect. A moment later, the large man lunged forward, testing her reflexes. She didn't panic. She moved with precision, sidestepping his approach and using his own momentum to guide him slightly off balance. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't violent, it was controlled, measured, enough to show that she could respond if needed. The other men gasped softly, surprised by her speed and confidence. "Not bad," she said quietly, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Try again if you want, but don't expect it to be easy." Her words were simple, but the message was clear. She was capable, and she wasn't intimidated. The large man hesitated, realizing that he had miscalculated. The other men looked at each other, uncertainty in their eyes. For the next hour, she allowed them small tests. A shove here, a jab there, each met with controlled movements, careful balance, and measured responses. She wasn't aggressive, but she wasn't passive either. Every demonstration reinforced her presence. Every subtle counteraction reminded them that she was not to be underestimated. By the end of the hour, the laughter that had marked the first days was gone. They weren't afraid, not yet, but they were cautious, respectful in a way they hadn't been before. During a brief break, she observed quietly from the edge of the yard. She noticed alliances forming, subtle shifts in the social structure. Some men who had tried to intimidate her now whispered nervously among themselves. Others glanced at her, calculating, reassessing their own positions. She had not fought anyone in a traditional sense, yet her presence alone had changed the dynamic. She realized that skill, confidence, and awareness could be as powerful as physical strength. Later, she was approached by one of the men who had remained quiet during the confrontation. He wasn't aggressive, but he wanted to understand. "How did you do that?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. She simply observed him for a moment, noting his posture and tone. Then she said, "I pay attention. I don't react without reason. I move when I need to, and I stay calm the rest of the time." Her words were simple, but they carried experience and wisdom. The man nodded slowly, realizing that there was more to her than he had thought. She wasn't just physically capable, she was mentally prepared, aware, and deliberate. He stepped back, a hint of respect in his posture. The yard around them continued to move, but there was a subtle shift. Some of the men who had been most aggressive now watched quietly, unsure of how to challenge her. By mid-afternoon, the yard had settled into a quieter rhythm. The men who had tested her earlier were no longer trying to provoke her. They had realized that she was aware, prepared, and capable of handling herself in ways they hadn't expected. She moved through the yard calmly, acknowledging nothing more than necessary, observing everything, and learning from every interaction. A smaller group approached later, attempting to test her with words rather than actions. They made jokes trying to belittle her to get a reaction. She ignored them, maintaining her calm and steady gaze. Her presence alone created tension, a quiet authority that was hard to ignore. The men eventually moved on, realizing that their usual tactics had no effect. She spent the rest of the day walking through the yard, observing and learning. She noticed how people moved when they were nervous, how alliances shifted when tension rose, and how respect could be earned without aggression. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle movement was information, and she absorbed it all. By evening, the yard had emptied, and she returned to her cell, reflecting on the day. She thought about the power of calmness, awareness, and strategic responses. She realized that she had not only survived the first real test, but had also begun to establish herself as someone who commanded quiet respect. She hadn't needed to fight aggressively, and she hadn't needed to raise her voice. Her strength lay in control, presence, and observation. As she lay on the narrow bed, she thought about the days ahead. The challenges would grow, but she felt prepared. She knew that her calmness, awareness, and confidence would continue to shape how people treated her. The men who had tried to intimidate her were learning that she was not an ordinary woman in this space. She was alert, prepared, and capable, and they could see it now. Sleep came slowly as her mind replayed the day's events. She reviewed interactions, analyzed body language, and reflected on the small victories of the day. She understood that survival in this environment wasn't about brute force alone. It was about control, perception, and strategy. By the time she drifted into sleep, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had faced her first real challenge and had emerged stronger, more aware, and respected in subtle but undeniable ways. The third day in the facility had taught her that observation, calmness and precise action, could be more powerful than aggression. She had learned that fear could be controlled, respect could be earned without confrontation, and that presence could shift the balance in ways that were invisible, but deeply felt. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to shape her own place in a world that had underestimated her. The next morning, the yard was buzzing with a tension that was sharper than before. News of her calmness and the small displays of skill from the previous days had spread, and the men who had once laughed were now watching her every move. Some whispered among themselves, trying to guess what she might do if provoked. The air seemed heavier, charged with curiosity and caution. She walked in as always, steady and measured, her eyes scanning, reading, and noting every detail. A few of the men who had been the boldest on the first day were waiting. They had spent the night talking, planning how to finally challenge her, to see if she was bluffing or if the calm, controlled presence she carried could withstand real confrontation. One of them, larger and more aggressive than the rest, stepped forward immediately. A smirk plastered across his face. He wanted to show dominance, to prove that a woman could not possibly hold her own in this environment. "You've been walking around like you own the place," he said loudly. "Time to see if you can back it up." His voice carried across the yard, drawing the attention of the others. Some were curious, others amused, and a few were skeptical. But most of all, they were waiting to see if she would finally break, if she would finally show fear. She stopped a few feet away, her stance steady and unshaken. She looked him directly in the eyes and said simply, "I handle what I need to handle." There was no challenge, no anger, only calm and absolute confidence. The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment no one moved. The silence was heavier than any shout, heavier than any threat. The man lunged forward, testing her reflexes, and she moved with a precision that caught him off guard. It wasn't fast in the sense of panic, but deliberate and exact. She shifted her weight, sidestepping his approach while guiding his movement slightly off balance. The impact was minimal, but the message was clear. She was ready and capable. The men around them stopped laughing. Even those who had underestimated her began to feel unease. "What the hell?" one of the men muttered under his breath. They had expected her to stumble or react clumsily, and instead she moved with confidence, skill, and control. Her calmness was almost unnerving. The larger man took a step back, confusion and frustration written across his face. He had assumed that she could be intimidated, and now that assumption was crumbling. The group tried again, this time in a coordinated effort. They came at her from different angles, hoping to overwhelm her with numbers. She didn't panic. She shifted, moved, and adjusted without aggression, her movements precise and measured. Each attempt to corner her was met with subtle yet effective maneuvers that kept her safe and in control. She wasn't using force to dominate. She was using skill to neutralize threats calmly and efficiently. By now, a crowd had formed, watching the unfolding scene. Some men whispered in disbelief. Others exchanged glances that reflected the growing realization that she was no ordinary woman in this environment. Her calmness and awareness were more than tactics, they were a statement. She wasn't just surviving. She was showing that she could handle herself against anyone, without losing control. One of the bolder men decided to escalate further. He grabbed a nearby object, thinking it would give him an advantage. She didn't react with panic, but she didn't ignore it either. She assessed the situation quickly, noticing the angle of his movements, the tension in his arms, and the rhythm of his stance. In a smooth motion, she disarmed the situation, redirecting the object harmlessly away and using his own momentum to step aside. The man stumbled slightly and froze, stunned. The yard fell silent. The men who had been trying to provoke her earlier were now frozen, unsure how to respond. The ones who had whispered before were now openly staring, their previous confidence replaced by a mix of awe and unease. For the first time, they truly saw her, not as a woman, not as an outsider, but as someone with real skill and the presence to back it up. She didn't raise her voice or make any dramatic gestures. She simply stood there, breathing steadily, her stance relaxed, yet ready. Her calmness was more powerful than any shout or display of aggression. The men around her realized that she wasn't bluffing. This was not luck or coincidence. She was trained, aware, and prepared, and they had no idea how far that capability could go. Then one of the men, clearly frustrated and desperate to assert dominance, moved toward her aggressively. This time she decided to demonstrate her expertise more clearly, not to harm, but to make a point. In a controlled, precise movement, she sidestepped his advance, used a gentle yet firm push to guide him off balance, and positioned herself so that he could not approach without losing control. The movement was fluid, almost effortless, but it carried a message that could not be ignored. The man stumbled and fell lightly to the ground, more surprised than hurt. He looked up at her, eyes wide, and for the first time, the bravado in his expression was gone. The others in the yard froze, some stepping back instinctively. They had assumed that strength alone would intimidate her, but they now understood that skill, control, and awareness could surpass brute force. A murmur ran through the crowd. Whispers spread. She had skill, real skill, and she had demonstrated it without aggression, without cruelty, without anger. The men who had laughed at her before were now watching with a new respect, even those who were still skeptical. The energy in the yard had shifted completely. She had earned a quiet authority that was palpable, even without a single boastful word. As the day went on, she moved through the yard with the same calm demeanor, but now the interactions were different. The men who had been aggressive before were hesitant, their usual tactics no longer effective. They tried small tests, but she met them with measured responses, subtle maneuvers, and calm authority. Each time, she reinforced the message that she was not to be underestimated. Some of the more cautious men approached her quietly, asking questions, seeking to understand her abilities. She responded carefully, sharing insight without arrogance, demonstrating that her skill was not just physical but also mental. She spoke about observation, awareness, and strategy, the ways in which understanding one's environment and reading people could be as powerful as any physical maneuver. By the end of the day, the yard had transformed. The men who had once mocked her were no longer loud, no longer brash. They watched, measured, and thought twice before attempting any challenge. She hadn't needed to fight aggressively. She had shown her skill in a controlled, deliberate manner that left a lasting impression. Respect had replaced ridicule, and her presence had become a force to be reckoned with. Returning to her cell, she reflected on the day. The controlled demonstrations had done more than assert her abilities. They had shifted the dynamics in subtle but undeniable ways. She realized that real authority wasn't about dominating others. It was about presence, awareness, and the ability to act decisively when necessary. She had shown her strength without unnecessary conflict, and that strength now spoke for her in ways words never could. As night fell, she lay on her narrow bed, replaying the day's events. She thought about each interaction, each movement, each small test. She understood that skill alone was not enough. It was how one applied it with control, intelligence, and awareness that made the difference. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had earned respect and established boundaries without compromising her principles. Sleep came eventually, but her mind remained sharp. She reviewed every detail: the men who had tested her, the body language, the shifts in attention, and the subtle hierarchy that had been reshaped. She understood that the days ahead would bring new challenges, but she felt prepared. Her calm, precise, and deliberate approach had changed how people saw her, and that change was more powerful than any fight could have been. By the end of Part 4, she had not only survived another day in the yard, but she had also demonstrated the depth of her combat expertise and the quiet authority that came with true skill. The men who had laughed at her were no longer laughing. They were aware, cautious, and respectful, understanding that she was someone who could handle herself in ways they had never expected. She had transformed from a target of ridicule into a figure whose presence demanded recognition, and the balance of power in the yard had shifted irrevocably. By the fifth day in the facility, things had changed. The yard was the same concrete space filled with noise, movement, and the usual tension, but the energy felt different when she entered. The men who had once mocked her now paused, their eyes following her calmly, carefully. They weren't afraid exactly, but they understood that she was no ordinary person here. Something about her presence demanded respect, even from those who were still skeptical. She walked in with her usual steady pace, scanning the yard with a practiced eye. Every movement, every glance she gave was deliberate. She noted who was watching her closely, who was whispering, and who was testing the edges of her calmness. She had already learned that observation was her strongest tool. By understanding the intentions and patterns of those around her, she could navigate this environment with both safety and authority. Some of the men who had been aggressive on previous days still tried small tests, but she handled each one with controlled precision. A shove here, a mocking word there. She responded not with anger, but with awareness and balance. Even when challenged directly, she moved in a way that neutralized the situation without creating unnecessary conflict. Her presence alone had become a kind of quiet barrier. Those who approached her too confidently learned quickly that their usual tactics would not work. A group of men decided to challenge her together, thinking that numbers might finally overwhelm her calm. They came at her with coordinated movements, trying to corner her near the fence. But she didn't panic. She shifted smoothly, reading their positioning, anticipating their movements, and redirecting their momentum without aggression. Each step was careful, each movement precise. By the time the men realized what had happened, they had already lost control of the encounter. One of the men tried to regain his dominance by stepping closer aggressively. She didn't flinch or raise her voice. Instead, she adjusted her stance, subtly shifting her weight and using a gentle push that guided him off balance. The rest of the group froze, unsure how to proceed. Her calm control had taken the place of brute strength, and it was far more effective. The yard fell silent for a few moments, the tension thick, as everyone absorbed what had just happened. It was clear now to all who watched that she was not a person to be underestimated. The small acts of skill she had demonstrated in previous days were not isolated incidents. They were evidence of real expertise, control, and confidence. The men who had mocked her at first now glanced at each other uncertainly, wondering how they had misjudged her so badly. Later, as the yard settled into its usual rhythm, she observed quietly from the edge. Some men approached cautiously, asking questions, seeking to understand her abilities rather than challenge them. She spoke sparingly but thoughtfully, explaining the importance of awareness, balance, and observation. She made it clear that skill wasn't just about physical strength, it was about understanding, anticipation, and control. Her explanations were simple but filled with meaning, and those who listened began to see her in a new light. By afternoon, even the guards began to notice the change. She moved through the yard with a calm authority that was unusual for someone so new. Her presence commanded attention, and her reputation had spread quietly. Those who had tried to provoke her were now hesitant, some even stepping aside to avoid unnecessary confrontation. She had shifted the dynamics of the yard without raising her voice or using unnecessary force. The men who had once been the loudest in mocking her began to act differently. Some avoided direct interaction, while others watched closely, showing subtle signs of respect. Even those who were skeptical recognized her skill and presence. She wasn't feared in a traditional sense, but she was acknowledged as someone who could handle herself and maintain control. Her calm, measured confidence had become her greatest strength. During a brief break, she noticed one of the previously aggressive men sitting alone, quietly reflecting. He had been part of the group that tried to challenge her with numbers. Now he seemed hesitant to return to the same behavior. She approached him calmly, not aggressively, and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't a gesture of superiority. It was a recognition of mutual understanding. The man nodded back, a subtle acknowledgement of respect forming between them. Throughout the day, small interactions reinforced her presence. She moved through the yard deliberately, engaging only when necessary and observing constantly. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered conversation added to her understanding of the environment. She was no longer just surviving. She was shaping the space around her. People adjusted their behavior around her without realizing it, drawn by the quiet authority she carried. As the evening approached, the yard began to empty. She remained alert, watching the routines, noting who had learned from the day's interactions and who had not yet adjusted. Even in the quieter moments, she continued to observe, to learn, and to maintain control. She understood that respect in this environment was not granted. It was earned through consistency, awareness, and the ability to act decisively when needed. Returning to her cell, she reflected on the week so far. The initial laughter and mockery had given way to caution and respect. She had faced the first real tests of her presence and skill, and had demonstrated both without unnecessary aggression. Her calm confidence had become her most powerful tool, transforming how others saw her and how she navigated this challenging environment. She thought about the lessons she had learned, the importance of observation, the value of patience, and the power of controlled response. She knew that true strength was not about confrontation for its own sake, but about understanding when to act and when to remain calm. By mastering this balance, she had not only survived but had begun to shape the environment in subtle but meaningful ways. That night, she lay on the narrow bed, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She reviewed interactions, analyzed gestures, and noted patterns that would guide her in the days ahead. She understood that her presence alone had already changed the behavior of those around her. She had earned respect not through dominance but through control, awareness, and calm skill. Sleep came slowly, but she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The days ahead would bring new challenges, but she was ready. She knew that her calm authority, combined with skill and awareness, would continue to shape the environment and ensure that she remained safe and respected. She had proven that even in a place designed to intimidate, strength could be demonstrated without aggression, and respect could be earned through presence and control. By the end of Part 5, she had fully established herself in the yard. The men who had once mocked and underestimated her now approached with caution, respect, or curiosity. She had transformed from a newcomer, a target of ridicule, into someone whose presence could not be ignored. She had earned a quiet authority, one that would last long after the initial confrontations, showing that strength, skill, and confidence could change perceptions and command respect, even in the harshest environments. Her journey in the facility had taught her that true power came from understanding, observation, and controlled action. She had faced mockery, challenges, and tests, and had emerged not just unbroken but stronger, more aware, and more capable. She had shown that presence and skill, applied with calm and confidence, could shift dynamics, earn respect, and leave a lasting impact. In that quiet moment, as the lights dimmed and the sounds of the prison faded, she understood that she had not just survived, she had proven herself, earned recognition, and created a space where she could continue to navigate with control, skill, and quiet authority. Her presence was now her power, and it would continue to guide her through whatever came next.